Welcome to the deep dive. You've sent us some excerpts from a logic textbook,
Oh, wow.
which seems pretty ambitious. We're going to be diving into categorical sentences, syllogisms, and truth functions.
All the building blocks of
Yeah,
logical
all
stuff.
good stuff, yeah. So we're going to sift through these dense concepts, pull out the most useful bits, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll be able to spot a logical fallacy from a mile away,
Ooh,
and maybe even impress your friends with a well-placed syllogism.
I love it.
Right. Okay, so before we get ahead of ourselves, let's start with the basics. What is logic? Really? I mean, when I think of logic, I think of like Spock from Star Trek.
Right.
All about cold, hard facts.
Well, logic is definitely about clear thinking, but it's not just about facts. It's more about the structure of arguments. It helps us figure out if a conclusion follows logically from its premises,
Right.
regardless of whether those premises are true in the real world.
So you're telling me an argument can be logically sound even if it's based on a lie?
Exactly. Think of it like a recipe. If you follow the steps perfectly, you'll get a cake.
Okay.
Even if you accidentally used salt instead of sugar.
Oh, interesting.
It might not be a tasty cake, but it'll be a cake nonetheless.
Okay, that makes sense. So logic is like the recipe, the argument is the cake,
Yeah,
the premises are the ingredients.
perfect.
But how does that help us in real life? I mean, we're not always dealing with arguments in such a formal way, are we?
That's where it gets interesting. Logic helps us understand the underlying structure of all kinds of arguments, even the informal ones we encounter every day.
Like when you're trying to convince your friend to go to that new sushi place.
Exactly. Or when you're reading a news article and trying to decide if the author's conclusion is justified. Logic gives us the tools to analyze those arguments, to see if the pieces fit together logically,
Okay.
and to spot any flaws in the reasoning.
So it's like having a mental toolkit for critical thinking.
Precisely. Now, the textbook you sent focuses on a specific type of logic called categorical logic, which deals with categories and relationships between them.
Okay, so like all dogs are mammals or no cats are birds.
You got it. Those are examples of categorical sentences, and they're the building blocks for syllogisms, which are classic logical arguments with two premises and a conclusion.
Syllogisms. Those always sounded so intimidating to me, like something a medieval scholar would ponder in a dusty library.
They can seem that way, but they're actually quite simple once you break them down. Remember that example from the textbook about Mormons and polygamy?
Oh, yeah. That one was pretty memorable. It showed how we can use Venn diagrams
Yes.
to visually represent those categories and see if the conclusion logically follows from the premises.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that there are only 15 valid syllogistic forms
Oh, wow.
out of a possible 64.
Wait, only 15. That means there are a lot more ways to construct an invalid argument than a valid one.
You're catching on. And that's why logic is so important. It helps us avoid those pitfalls of faulty reasoning, those subtle errors that can lead us to wrong conclusions.
So it's like a mental safety net, protecting us from those logical tripwires.
I like that. Now, the textbook also delves into truth functions, which can seem a bit more abstract.
Yeah, those symbols and equations always make my head spin a little.
I hear you. But think of truth functions like a codebreaker's toolkit.
Okay.
They help us decipher complex statements by breaking them down into their component parts and analyzing the logical relationships between them.
The textbook used some examples about tax regulations and fluid pressure levels.
Right.
Those seemed pretty relevant to real-world problems.
They were. And those truth functions can actually be surprisingly useful in everyday situations. Like if you're trying to figure out if you qualify for a discount based on a bunch of conditions.
Or deciphering those complicated terms and conditions agreements that nobody ever reads.
Exactly. Truth functions can help you cut through the jargon and see the underlying logic.
This is making me realize how much logic underpins our daily lives, even when we're not consciously aware of it. It's like the scaffolding that holds up our thinking.
That's a great analogy. And the more we understand that scaffolding,
Right.
the more stable and sound our thinking becomes.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get a feel for these truth functions.
Good.
But the text also mentions something called reduction ad absurdum, which sounds pretty intense.
It does sound dramatic, right?
Right.
But it's actually a very clever method of proof.
Okay.
It's like proving something is true by showing that the opposite is impossible.
Okay, can you give me an example? My brain is already doing backflips trying to wrap my head around this.
Absolutely. Remember that example from the textbook about unclimbed mountains?
Yeah.
Let's say we start with the premise, all mountains taller than Kanchenjunga are unclimbed.
Okay, yeah, I remember that one. And then it introduced the idea that Annapurna is a mountain taller than Kanchenjunga.
Right. And if those two statements are true, we can conclude that Annapurna is unclimbed. But with reduction ad absurdum, we'd start by assuming the opposite, that Annapurna has been climbed.
So we're basically saying, okay, let's pretend Annapurna has been climbed and see where that takes us.
Exactly. And if that assumption combined with our original premises leads to a contradiction, then we know our initial assumption must be wrong.
Because if Annapurna is taller than Kanchenjunga and has been climbed, then our premise that all mountains taller than Kanchenjunga are unclimbed would be false. It creates a paradox.
You got it. And that paradox proves that our original assumption that Annapurna has been climbed must be false.
Okay.
Therefore, our original conclusion that it's unclimbed must be true.
It's like a logical puzzle where you fit the pieces together.
Exactly.
To reveal a hidden truth.
Reduction ad absurdum is a powerful technique, especially when dealing with complex arguments where directly proving a statement might be very difficult.
It's making me think about all those online debates where people make outlandish claims. Maybe we should start using reduction ad absurdum more often to expose the flaws in their logic.
It could be a valuable tool, though in those heated online debates, sometimes logic takes a backseat to emotion, unfortunately.
That's true. Speaking of emotions, it's interesting how the textbook touches on the limitations of logic. It acknowledges that logic isn't the be-all and end-all of understanding the world.
It's refreshing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Logic is a powerful tool, but it's not a magic wand. There are many aspects of human experience that logic alone can't fully grasp, like love, art, morality, These are realms where intuition, emotion, and subjective experience also play a vital role.
It's like logic provides the framework, the structure for thinking. But it can't dictate the content of our thoughts or feelings.
That's a great way to put it. It reminds me of that quote by Albert Einstein. Logic will get you from A to B. Imagination will take you everywhere.
I love that. It highlights the importance of balancing logical thinking with creativity and intuition.
Absolutely. We need both to navigate the complexities of life and the world around us.
This deep dive is really pushing me to think outside the box, to consider different perspectives and approaches to understanding the world.
That's the beauty of engaging with these concepts. It's not just about learning the rules of logic, It's about expanding our mental horizons and challenging our assumptions.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
Explored categorical sentences, syllogisms, truth functions.
Finished the good stuff.
Even dipped our toes into the philosophy of language.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, is there anything in the text that really stood out to you? Something that sparked your own curiosity?
You know what really caught my attention was that section on quantifiers.
Quantifiers. Well,
those symbols that represent all, some, and none. They seem simple, but they play such a crucial role in how we make generalizations and construct logical arguments.
I can see how they add a layer of precision and nuance to our language. Like, the difference between saying all birds can fly and some birds can fly is pretty significant.
Exactly. And the text talks about how we can use quantifiers to translate everyday English sentences into a more formal, logical language.
It's like we're creating a secret code for expressing logical relationships.
It kind of is. And that code can be surprisingly helpful for analyzing arguments and clarifying meaning.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Let's take a simple sentence like, all dogs are loyal.
Okay.
We can represent that sentence symbolically using quantifiers and predicates.
Okay. Remind me, what's a predicate again?
A predicate is basically a property or characteristic that we're ascribing to something.
Right.
So in that sentence, loyal would be the predicate.
Got it. So how would we translate the entire sentence into symbols?
We'd use the symbol x to represent the universal quantifier all, dx to represent x is a dog, and x to represent x is loyal.
So the sentence would become x, dx, lx.
You nailed it. It reads, for all x, if x is a dog, then x is loyal.
It's amazing how much information that one little line of symbols can convey. It's like compressing a complex thought into a tiny logical package.
It is, and that's the power of formal logic. It allows us to express complex ideas concisely and unambiguously. It's like a logical shorthand that helps us cut through the clutter of natural language and get to the heart of an argument.
This is making me want to go back and analyze all those old philosophical texts I struggled with in college.
Oh, I know, right?
Maybe I'll finally be able to understand them now.
That's the great thing about learning these tools.
Yeah.
They can unlock new levels of understanding in all sorts of texts and arguments.
Okay, so we've got these quantifiers. We're translating sentences into symbols. It's all starting to feel a bit like a logic puzzle, which I have to admit I'm kind of enjoying.
I knew you'd come around.
Yeah.
And speaking of puzzles, the text mentions something called derivations.
Derivations.
Which are basically step-by-step logical proofs.
Oh, derivations. Sounds a little intimidating. We're going to have to break out our whiteboards and start scribbling equations?
No whiteboards necessary. Yeah. But derivations are like building a logical bridge from your premises to your conclusion using a set of rules called inference rules.
So it's like following a logical recipe.
That's a perfect analogy.
Okay.
And just like with a recipe, there are certain ingredients and steps you need to follow to get the right result.
The text mentions a few of those inference rules.
Yeah.
Any that come to mind?
One that's particularly important is called modus ponens.
Modus ponens.
It basically says that if you have a conditional statement,
right,
like if it's raining, then the ground is wet, and you know the first part is true,
right,
it's raining,
yeah,
then you can automatically conclude that the second part is also true. The ground is wet.
It seems pretty straightforward.
It is.
Almost obvious.
Yeah.
But I guess that's the point of these inference rules, right? To formalize those basic patterns of logical thinking that we often use intuitively.
You got it. Modus ponens is just one example, but there are many other inference rules, each with its own logic and application. By combining these rules, we can construct complex derivations, carefully piecing together logical steps to arrive at a solid conclusion. It's like building a logical fortress, brick by logical brick.
It sounds challenging, but also kind of satisfying.
It is.
Like solving a Sudoku puzzle.
It can be both. And the more you practice, the more you'll start to see those patterns of logical inference everywhere.
Yeah.
Not just in formal arguments, but in everyday conversations and reasoning.
You know, what's fascinating to me is that the text acknowledges that even with all these tools and rules, there are still limits to what logic can do. It can't capture the full complexity of language or the nuances of human thought.
That's a really important point. Logic is a framework for thinking, but it's not a straitjacket.
Right.
There will always be gray areas, ambiguities, and exceptions.
Like in that example we discussed earlier about mountains.
Yeah.
In the real world, there are unclimbed mountains, but we were able to create a hypothetical world where all mountains were climbable. It shows how logic can operate in realms beyond our immediate experience.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating. It's not just about applying rules.
Right.
It's about exploring the boundaries of possibility and understanding the nature of truth itself.
This deep dive is really making me question everything I thought I knew about logic. It's not just about winning arguments. It's about expanding our understanding of the world and ourselves.
I couldn't agree more. It's a journey of intellectual discovery, and it's a journey that never really ends.
Okay, so we've explored the theoretical side of things.
Yeah.
But I'm itching to put some of this knowledge into practice.
Okay.
The text mentions a few exercises. Would you be up for tackling one with me?
Bring it on. I'm always up for a good logical challenge.
All right, let's start with this one. It says, if the fund doesn't reach its goal, then the canvassers won't work hard. Therefore, either the fund will reach its goal or the canvassers won't work hard.
Okay.
What do you think? Is this argument logically valid?
Okay, let's break it down. We have a conditional statement. If the fund doesn't reach its goal, then the canvassers won't work hard. And the conclusion is presented as an either statement.
It seems like the conclusion is just restating the premise in a slightly different way.
You're on the right track. This argument actually reflects a common logical equivalence.
Okay.
If P, then Q is logically equivalent to not P or Q.
So in this case, P would be the fund doesn't reach its goal.
Yes.
And Q would be the canvassers won't work hard.
Exactly. So the argument is essentially saying that if the fund doesn't reach its goal, then the canvassers won't work hard.
Okay.
Or if the fund does reach its goal, then, well, it doesn't matter if the canvassers work hard or not.
So it is logically valid, even though it feels a bit circular?
Precisely. And that's a common tactic in arguments.
Right.
To present a conclusion that seems distinct from the premise, but is actually just a rephrasing of it.
It makes you realize how important it is to pay attention to the underlying structure of an argument.
Yes.
Not just the surface wording.
Absolutely. Words can be slippery, but logic can help us cut through the ambiguity and see the underlying relationships between ideas.
Okay, let's try another one. This one involves a quote from Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida. For to be wise in love exceeds man's might. that dwells with gods above.
That's a beautiful quote, and a perfect example of how logic can be applied to literature.
The challenge here is to translate this quote into quantificational symbolism, right?
That's right. Can you give it a shot?
Right, let's see. The quote seems to be saying that it's impossible for a human to be both wise and in love at the same time.
That's a good starting point. Now, how can we express that using quantifiers and predicates?
Well, we could use WX to represent X is wise, LX to represent X is in love, and HX to represent X is human.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Now, how would you combine those elements to reflect the quote's meaning?
How about X, HX, WX, and LX?
That's absolutely perfect. It reads, for all X, if X is human, then it's not the case that X is both wise and in love.
Wow. It's amazing how this symbolic language can capture such a complex thought so concisely. It's like a logical haiku.
I love that. It really highlights the elegance and precision of formal logic.
You know, this whole deep dive has been like a mental workout.
It has.
I feel like I'm seeing the world through a new lens.
Good.
Noticing logical patterns and connections everywhere I look.
That's the power of engaging with these concepts. Logic is not just an abstract academic subject.
Right.
It's a way of thinking that can enhance our understanding of the world.
Yeah.
And empower us to make more informed decisions.
It's like logic gives us a mental compass.
I like that.
Helping us navigate the complexities of information and arrive at sound conclusions.
That's a great way to put it, and it's a compass that we can all learn to use.
I feel like we've been training for a logic marathon. And now we're in the final stretch.
And you've been crushing it. You're picking up these concepts so quickly.
Well, having a fantastic coach definitely helps. But seriously, I'm amazed by how much we've covered. From like those basic building blocks of logic to some pretty mind-bending concepts.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride.
It has been. We even managed to translate Shakespeare into logical symbols.
That was fun.
Yeah, right. That's definitely going on my resume.
Huh.
But before we get too carried away celebrating, I'm curious to hear your final thoughts.
Okay.
What's the most valuable takeaway from our deep dive into logic?
For me, it's the reminder that logic isn't just about finding the, quote, right answer. It's more about asking the right questions, approaching things with a curious and skeptical mind,
right,
and being willing to challenge our own assumptions.
So it's not about being right all the time, but more about being open to different perspectives and constantly refining our understanding.
Yeah, and recognizing that there are limits to what logic can do. It's a powerful tool, but it's not a magic bullet. We also need intuition,
right,
empathy, and creativity to navigate the complexities of life.
It's like logic provides the framework, the structure for thinking,
right,
but it can't dictate the content of our thoughts or feelings.
That's a great way to put it. It's like having a beautifully organized toolbox.
Right.
Logic helps us keep those tools sharp and in order, but it's up to us to decide which tools to use and how to use them.
And sometimes we might need to step outside the toolbox altogether and rely on, our gut feeling or creative inspiration.
Absolutely. Logic isn't meant to replace other ways of knowing.
Right.
It's meant to complement them.
This deep dive has really been an eye-opener. It's made me realize that logic isn't just some abstract academic pursuit. It's like woven into the fabric of our daily lives.
It is.
From the way we make decisions to the way we interact with others, logic is always at play.
It is. And the more we understand those logical underpinnings, the more effectively we can navigate the world around us. We become better thinkers, communicators, and problem solvers.
We've explored so much in this deep dive. We've journeyed through the world of categorical logic, tackled syllogisms, Venn diagrams, truth functions.
Oh, the essential.
Even dipped our toes into the philosophy of language.
Oh, yeah.
And we've seen how these concepts can help us analyze arguments, identify fallacies, and construct more compelling and persuasive claims.
It's been quite a journey.
It has been an incredible journey, and we hope this deep dive has inspired you to continue exploring the fascinating world of logic.
Definitely.
Keep those logic muscles flexed.
Yeah.
And never stop questioning, exploring, and expanding your horizons.
And remember that quote from Shakespeare? To be wise in love exceeds man's might. Logic can illuminate our path, but some truths lie beyond its reach. Stay curious, stay open-minded, and embrace the mystery and wonder of the world around us.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.